Hello. So we are going to wrap up the self-strengthening movement. Um, this is important to talk about, even though it was a relatively short period of time. It's important because it influenced the thoughts of some people who went on to really, really change China in the near future after this. Um, so usually, if we were in class, I'd give you this sheet, and we would do some readings and answer some questions and stuff. But I am just going to throw this out to you with the answer key instead. Lucky. Here we go. So, some basic understanding of self strengthening. We talked about this yesterday. What was the major question that left people starting the self strengthening movement? The answer: why are we failing so badly? This was, remember the beginning of the century of humiliation, is what it was called. 100 years where, no matter what China does, they just stink at it and they get their butts kicked constantly. And so, why is the question that they start to ask, and what can we do about it? So, the goal of self strengthening is kind of obvious from the title of the movement, right? They want to strengthen themselves, they want to become stronger. What's not obvious is some of the logic behind it because it's not in the title. Um, the goal was to use Western, which is barbarian, practices to fight Western problems. So, in other words, when the British showed up and we had the Opium War and everything, China had a bigger military. The British Navy that was available for the Opium Wars is not that big. But every single time they fought with the Chinese, they beat them and beat them easily, right? So, what was the deal with that? Zheng Guofan and some of those guys, Li Hongzhang, they started to look at their armies and say, well, you know what? Big part of the problem was our technology. We need better guns, we need better ships, we need better weapons, cannons, artillery, that kind of stuff, and better transportation. And so what did they do? They started to implement Western style improvement to their military. They started to get new guns, they started to build factories, shipyards that could build steamships and that kind of stuff. And that was the beginning of the self strengthening movement. Now, when you start building, technology, military technology, well, you also need schools that teach science, engineering, chemistry, that kind of stuff. And so that also naturally branched off of the self strengthening idea. And they started to look at all aspects of Chinese life and say, well, what could we fix that would be better if we did it like the Westerners? Now, the problem with self strengthening was there were two major camps, two groups, right? There was the first group that said, here's the problem with self strengthening. We're Chinese. We need to focus on being the best Chinese people we can and stop trying to be wannabe barbarians because we're different from them and we're never going to be exactly the same as them. So why do we try to copy them and try to imitate them when what we really should do is probably go back to our origins, our roots? Let's look at Confucius more. Let's see what he had to say. Let's look at the Duke of Zhou. Let's read all these old texts from a couple thousand years ago. Let's look at our traditions and let's do that, and we'll naturally become better. And so that was that side of things. And their idea was, well, let's cut China off from the outside world. Let's not be connected into it. And let's just not do the self-strengthening thing because it's not going to help, right? We know what helps. Confucius taught us what helps. Let's do that. Okay, so there's your first camp. The other camp, this was the self-strengtheners. This was the reformers. These were people like the emperor and like Kang Youwei, his friend who got him to do self-strengthening. These guys said, you know what, we've got a problem. It's not that self-strengthening isn't good. We're not doing it. We're not doing enough of it. Okay, so if you're going to do self-strengthening, you have to fully do this thing or it won't help. One example would be railroads and trains. If you're going to really do the self-strengthening thing and build railroads, well, you better have train tracks throughout the entire country. You better connect all the major cities, and you better have trains and engineers and stuff. But with some of the half-hearted self-strengthening efforts, especially those that were supported like Empress Dowager Cixi, they didn't really do it. They did some self-strengthening in some places, but that wasn't enough to actually fix the problem. So the first camp says, stop self-strengthening. We're Chinese. We're different from the rest of the world. Let's be Chinese. The other camp said, let's do self-strengthening, but let's do it 100% and let's actually get the job done. That was the big difference in those two camps. Now, these guys over here that said, let's do more of the self-strengthening, they used an analogy. They said that the problems China has, it's like having a sliver in your hand. You ever get a sliver or a splinter? You just stick a Band-Aid on that thing and it's going to get better, right? Yeah, not wrong. You got to actually get some tweezers or something. You have to pull the sliver out. And then the wound will heal and you'll get better. And so they said the problems we have, they're like the splinters. We can't just leave them. We got to fix things. We've got to change systems. We got to change schools, government, exam system, our factories, our banking system, our highways and transportation. We got to change all of that or we're never going to get better. So those are the two camps on self-strengthening. Now, we're going to take a look at a couple of documents here. And they're going to come from this website, Asia for Educators. Asia for Educators is put on by Columbia University. They just have a lot of good resources. So you can find all of this on there. Now, what we're going to do is just really quickly, we're going to read through some thoughts from self-strengthening advocates. Chu Chungbo was one of these guys. So he wrote a memo that went to the Guangxi Emperor right after Japan defeated the Qing in 1895. And just some snippets of what he said. He said, at the beginning, Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang and others, because of the danger from abroad was becoming daily more serious, strongly emphasized Western learning. In order to effect large-scale manufacture, they built shipyards and machine factories. Truly, no effort was spared in the attempt to establish new institutions after the pattern of the West. Perfunctory execution of these reforms. Now, what does perfunctory mean? Let's look it up. Dictionary.com. Performed merely as a routine duty, hasty, superficial, lacking interest, care, or enthusiasm, indifferent. So, if we do the self-strengthening half-heartedly, these reforms brought us to a point now where the island barbarians, the Japanese, have suddenly invaded us, and the whole situation of the nation has deteriorated. Was it because there were no reforms, or because the reforms were no good? The real mistake was that we did not secure the right men to manage the new institutions. If we secure the right persons, all things can be transformed without a trace. But if we do not obtain the right persons, laws and institutions will only serve the nefarious designs of the wicked. So his sum on this one, real mistake is that we didn't put good people in place to actually make these changes, make these reforms. Kang Youwei, this is the guy that got the emperor to do self-strengthening, and he's also the guy that was not rounded up, arrested, and executed like the others. He escaped to Japan. So Kang Youwei, he was a low-ranking scholar and official. He did not make it up to the top, to the capital, but somehow he got the emperor's attention. Okay, so just some clips. We won't read the whole thing with him here. But he says a survey of all the states in the world, and remember when we're talking global affairs, state actually means country. A survey of all the states in the world will show that those states that undertook reforms became strong, while the states that clung to the past perished. Our present trouble lies in our clinging to old institutions without knowing how to change. In an age of competition between states to put into effect methods appropriate to an era of universal unification and laissez-faire, which is the idea of free trade, is like wearing heavy furs in the summer or riding a high carriage across the river. It is a principle of things that the new is strong, but the old is weak. Moreover, our present institutions are but the unworthy vestiges of the Han, Tang, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. In fact, they are the products of the fancy writing and corrupt dealings of petty officials rather than the original ideas of the ancestors. Remember, this is the guy that said that Confucius's writings were forgeries? Yeah, that's kind of what he's going off of. After studying ancient and modern institutions, Chinese and foreign, I have found that the institutions of the sage kings and the three dynasties were excellent, but the ancient times were different from today. So the times have changed, right? So because times have changed, we have to change our government too. I beg your majesty to adopt the purpose of Peter the Great of Russia as our purpose, and to take the Meiji reform of Japan as the model for our reform. So he looked at other old countries that were changing and modernizing. He says, let's do that just like they did. And then he also throws this point in here. Nowadays, the court has been undertaking some reforms, but the action of the emperor is obstructed by the ministers, and the recommendations of able scholars are attacked by old-fashioned bureaucrats. So he's again in the camp of saying we're not doing enough self-strengthening because some of the conservative factions are stopping us. All right, two more thinkers here. Yan Fu. Yanfu. Let's see. Learning from the West. This is interesting because this shows us not just a logical perspective, but a cultural perspective too on how our background influences us. He says, I think the greatest difference between China and the West, which can never be made up, is that the Chinese are fond of antiquity but neglect the present. The Westerners are struggling in the present in order to supersede the past. Chinese consider that a period of order and a period of disorder, a period of prosperity and a period of decline are the natural course of heavenly conduct of human affairs. So the Chinese kind of see that cycle that we've talked about in class. Chaos, order, all that kind of stuff, right? Strictness, golden age. Westerners, they don't see a big long-term cycle. They just see, well, let's make things better now than they used to be. So they're constantly progressing, right? Well, Westerners consider that daily progress should be endless and that what has already been prosperous will not decline, and that when things are well governed, they will not be in disorder again, all of which they take as an absolute law of academic thought and political ideas. Okay, so he gives an interesting comparison. The foundation and the use mean the same thing. The body of an ox should have the use of carrying heavy things. The body of a horse should have the use of carrying something to a distance. I've never heard that the ox is the body or the foundation, while the horse is for use. The difference between Chinese and Western knowledge is as great as the difference between the complexions and the eyes of the two races. We cannot force the two cultures to be the same or similar. Therefore, Chinese knowledge has its foundation and function. Western knowledge has also its foundation and function. If the two are separate, each can be independent. If the two are combined, both would perish. So which camp does this guy fall into? The Chinese side of things. He's saying, we're Chinese, we're different. We need different things than what the Westerners need. Don't try to combine them. If the two are combined, they'll perish. Okay, last guy we'll look at here, Feng Guifan. Feng Guifan was one of the leaders of the effort to modernize the military, basically. He was a classically educated scholar who had a successful career as an official on his own, but also as an advisor to the leading Qing statesmen of the mid-19th century. So let's look at his books on math, mechanics, optics, light, chemistry, and all others all contain the ultimate principles of understanding things. Most of this information is unavailable to the people of China, so they don't know about science. I've heard that with their new methods, the Westerners have found that the movements of the earth conform closely to those of the heavens. This can be of assistance in fixing the calendar. If you know anything about the Chinese lunar calendar, you know it's kind of nuts. It's why Chinese New Year sometimes is in mid-January and sometimes it's in late February, and it moves around every year. It's because their calendar wasn't very good. I've heard the Westerners' method of clearing sand from harbors is very effective. This can be of assistance keeping the water flowing. Remember, China is connected by waterways, right? Also, for agricultural and sericultural tools and things required for the various crafts, they mostly use mechanical wheels, which require little energy but accomplish much. There are many intelligent people in China. Surely there are some who, having learned from the barbarians, can surpass them. So, China could be better than the West if we would just learn some of the things that they've learned, right? We could pass those on. So that is it for the video, and I will attach an assignment that goes with this in Google Classroom.